on this gorgeous sunny afternoon, we're going to talk about crime in the big sky. We're going to talk about things dark. I'm your moderator, obviously. I'm Gwen Florio. I live here in Missoula, and I've written a 5-book crime series starring a protagonist named Lola Wicks, and I'm about to start a new one that'll come out next year. We have here with us Alan Morris Jones and Lise McClendron. Lise is a longtime Montana author who's lived in and written about many places in the state and the world, I will say. She's written thrillers as Rory Tate, dark humor as Thalia. Thalia, is that how you say it?
Thalia, yes.
Thalia Filbert. Under her own name, she writes the Bennett Sisters mystery series featuring 5 sisters who are all attorneys. She lives in the wilds of Montana along the Madison River near Yellowstone National Park. Alan Morris Jones is author of acclaimed novels Last Year's River, which was chosen as a Barnes & Noble Discover pick, and A Bloom of Bones, which was an honor book for the Montana Book Award. He's appeared on the PBS NewsHour as a guest essayist and seen rave reviews of his work appear on the Today Show and in the LA Times, People Magazine, Publishers Weekly, Booklist, and many others. He's the former editor of Big Sky Journal, a former acquisitions editor for the Lions Press, and publisher of his own small press, Bangtail Press. In 2018, he published his first children's book, Montana for Kids, The Story of Our State. He lives in Bozeman, Montana with his wife and young son. And speaking of publishing your first children's book, one thing that struck me about both of you, we'll talk a little, I want them each to read too, but your works are really varied. You know, you write a children's book, you wrote a very pretty crime novel this year, you've written nonfiction. That's quite an impressive array. And you, woman, you are all over the map, literally. Your books take place in Paris, Jackson Hole. You have cozy mysteries, you have darker ones, you have my favorite category, a new adult novel, which I think is a little naughty, if I'm not mistaken.
Not too naughty.
Okay. And so again, before you read, I'd like each of you to talk about just the variety of your work and how you juggle all of that mentally. I think my brain would crack if I had to jump among genres that way.
Well, for me, it's a blessing to be able to switch and do different things. It keeps me fresh, you know. And I started out writing just mystery series, like Gwen. I have 4 books set in an art gallery owner in Jackson Hole. All the books aren't set right there, but and then I wrote a couple historical mysteries set in Kansas City, where I used to live, and in the late 30s, which was a fascinating time. I love history, so so it's whatever it's the joy of having a fiction career, if you can call it that. It's kind of a career. But is that often you can write whatever you want. Right now, I do feel I'm like up to 9 in this series that I'm writing about now, about the 5 sisters, and I do feel like, I have to write another one of those, because that's what people have started to, ask for. They want more. So in that way, that's the only reason to keep doing something. If you wanted to do something different, is to satisfy readers. That, if you want to have a career, you have to do a little bit of that as well.
Ellen?
Let's put it on the floor.
Okay.
Okay. Around behind, are we good?
Yeah,
We're good.
Okay.
Try not to electrocute the writers.
So for me, I guess the variety is a reflection of my attempt to keep it interesting. I figured out fairly early on that if my heart isn't in a project, if I am doing it for reasons other than my own curiosity and my own selfish inspiration, that the work turns wooden and affected. And if I decide, okay, I'm going to write a bestseller, I'm going to sit down and write a book that everybody's going to read, then what comes out is pretty lifeless and shitty. So in order for me to have a chance at writing something that's any good at all, my heart really has to be in it, which means that lately I've been writing a lot of poetry. I have no idea if the poetry's any good or not. That's kind of out of my hands. But here's what I want to write. And when the time came when I wanted to write a children's book, you know, that was, I really wanted to write something for my kid. I have an 8-year-old little boy, and I wanted to write something that he would like to read, you know, so that was where that came from. It's following your muse is trite and cliched, but I think there's something to the cliche. You know?
Yeah, I agree with all that.
Yeah.
Well, having talked a little bit about your work,
Okay.
why don't each of you read a little? I'd love to hear it.
Okay.
And then we'll talk more.
Well, I'm going to read a little bit about from my latest book, which is A Bolt from the Blue. This is the 9th book in the series. Actually, the 8th is this little cookbook, so it doesn't really count. But anyway, this is about this is set in the hinterlands, but it's not Montana. It's set in the hinterlands of France. So this piece is actually takes place in the middle of the novel, but I put it at the beginning, which is a kind of an old writerly trick. So you actually read it twice in the novel. The morning light dimmed as Francie Bennett maneuvered her rental car through the narrow lanes of the backwoods of the Dordogne and into La de Garonne to the south. The trees grew thick, arching over the road. Where once the skies were fierce and blue, the sun warm on the side of her face, now the oppressive greens and browns of the woods blotted all that out. Was it some kind of omen? She doubted it, but nothing about this estate had been ordinary. She wound her way on ever smaller roads, following the directions from her phone. My character's up now. They don't use maps anymore, like just like everyone else. They use their phones. Otherwise, she would have been lost for days, driving in circles down shaded lanes far from civilization. She'd once marveled that cosmopolitan France, land of manners and fashion and cuisine and sophistication, could still have such neglected backwaters. Where were the house flippers and the Brits on the prowl? These places seemed untouched by modernization, neglected, and gone to rot. The mission to find this old house had sounded delicious, even mysterious, and evoking a girlish curiosity that Francie was glad to discover she hadn't outgrown. To outlive curiosity, to be jaded about the unknown and undiscovered, would be tragic. So here she was, deep in the rural Aquitaine, far from vineyards and goats and, well, people, to open an old woman's manse that no one had cared about for nearly 40 years. There was no village, no town square, post office, or store, not much of anything but overgrown lots, cows, and sparse stands of trees. The destination was approached carefully, with intention, winding around hummocks and along streams. It was on no maps, just a blip on an unnamed road. A hamlet, something she somehow associated with small ham sandwiches. Ridiculous, yes. But that's what it was. A collection of a few houses of varying sizes on acreages with falling down barns and grass up to your knees. She slowed to a crawl, phone in hand, looking at directions. This must be the place. She turned off the car and stepped into the weeds. Putting aside visions of rats and pigeons, she stood outside the stone house, dangling the keys. Of course she was curious. She'd read about apartments in Paris that had been boarded up during the war and never touched for 60 years, museums of a long-gone time. Would this old house be fabulous or simply disgusting? Merle's cottage had been more filthy than delightful at first. This house was much larger than her sister's. Not a chateau like she fantasized, but a good-sized villa. The old lady apparently came from a family of aristocrats, what was left of them in secular socialist, post-revolution, post-war France. A lapsed duke, a long-ago count, they remained, their wealth often tied up in land and houses no one wanted, or their fortunes gone forever along with their heads. 2 stories of weathered gray stone, the mansion had a roof that sported fancy gables and odd-shaped windows, indicating a 3rd floor under the slates. Windows were shuttered, a soft, peeling rose color, or smothered by vines. The yard was flat, cream-colored gravel, overrun with weeds. Dry, prickly thistles scratched those who dared to enter. A half-dead tree stood guard, its leaves yellow and black. Villa Pardue was not quite a mansion, not anymore. The first padlock on the door shutters was awkward and rusty, but with a few trials it popped open. The shutters creaked and one hinge fell apart. Now, key in the door lock, she wiggled it for 2 minutes before she felt it give. The house didn't want to give up its secrets, that was obvious. Then it turned, a loud metallic click, just as her cell phone rang. It was Dylan. "Did you find it?" "I think so." He read off the address again, which didn't help. "There are no street signs, no numbers, no signs of any kind." "Well, if the key works, there's your answer. I'm unlocking the door right now." The padlock on the shutter opened. "What's it like?" "On the outside, about what you'd expect, dirty and weedy. Pretty big, but in the middle of serious French nowhere. Not another house or a person in sight. All the shutters seem intact, though, and the roof looks good, from the front at least. Nothing growing through the slates." She slipped her phone back in her pocket and pushed open the double doors. The stale stench of dust, mold, and animal droppings swept past her as if glad to be free. But there was something else, flowery, powdery. Her eyes blinked against the darkness. She paused, pulled out a small flashlight, and stepped inside. So,
Thank you.
That's awesome.
I do love old houses.
I love the idea of a Hamlet being a small ham sandwich.
Which I'm going to think about.
It's in your head. You won't be able to think of anything else. I also like the idea, maybe a panel discussion about the way cell phones have changed crime fiction.
Well, yeah.
This is so funny you said that. I am literally on a panel next month at VoucherCon on how cell phones have changed journalists as novelists, protagonists.
Yeah.
Right.
So, yeah.
I mean,
Well, that's why Sue Grafton never got her character Kinsey Mahone past the 1980s. She just kept her kind of stuck in the past because she never had to deal with the internet or cell phones. She was just an old-fashioned gumshoe.
Yeah. Well, the engine of your story is always the unanswered question, right? And as soon as you have a phone in your pocket, you can answer pretty much anything, right?
Right.
So,
Right. I love secrets, though.
yeah. So, Swinging on the Rocks is a crime novel that's largely set in a fictionalized Livingston. I call it Rockjaw. And the protagonist is a guy who's been in Montana for about 12 years. He's got a complicated history, which is revealed through the course of the novel. It involves Italian gangsters and the mob and witness protection. The idea it's a book that hopefully doesn't take itself too seriously. I quickly found writing in this particular arena that as soon as I started taking myself seriously, the prose kind of turned wooden and not very interesting at all. So it's meant to be a little tongue-in-cheek. This particular scene, he has come home to find a body arranged in his favorite easy chair, his old pal of a piece of furniture. And rather than call the cops and rather than start that machinery rolling, he decides to just get rid of the body. Easiest solution to a complicated problem.
As one does.
As one does. You know what I mean? What are you going to do?
Why not?
He parks in the middle of the Highway 89 bridge, the Yellowstone rolling black and silver below. 2 o'clock in the morning, there's a half moon and an empty road. Deep water down there, rolling, splashing, grumbling, anxious for the Missouri. Full of big fish. Brown trout, sulking. Once a year, some old fart gets his picture in the paper holding a 12-pounder. You got retired time on your hands, you can dredge streamers all day long. Stepping out of his truck, it's quiet enough he can hear the squeak of his truck springs. An odd feeling standing in the middle of an empty highway. All this road just for him. 500 yards behind him, long-haul truckers growl down I-90. Ahead, an empty scroll toward Clyde Park, Wilsaw, Ringling, a series of diminishing small towns nested like Russian dolls. The crazy mountains in dark horizon. To the east, nothing but wind and sage in a downhill run toward Appalachia. Not quite hurrying, he lifts the body out of the bed. A few strands of loose hay trickle out onto the road. The body sags into a U and he catches it with his knee, quick steps it toward the edge of the bridge, lets it rest briefly on the railing, Father, Son, Holy Ghost, and rolls it over into the river. A long moment, then a splash. Later, there will be regret. The thoughts of the body tumbling along, maybe even now, rolling on the gravel bottom, the hard current playing with eyelashes, exposing blank pupils. What was his name? His nickname? His mother, father, brother? What were his dreams, his sins, his penances? Nobody deserves to rest unmarked and unremarked upon. Sure, I mean, he probably had it coming, but nobody deserves it. Until now, Sweeney hasn't had time to feel anything but panic. First thought, save my ass. Now, however, staring down at the dark water, the glint of silver on ripples. If old times are an indication, he'll soon turn into a maudlin mess. How much we take for granted, all these small miracles. Buttons, chewing gum, zippers, unlocking his truck, turning the ignition, his cell phone, his microwave, jet contrails. In aggregate, are extraordinary days. And yet, we die. Maybe the body's already caught against some tangled root, the current making a floating gauze of his hair, minnows swimming into the open mouth, picking through his teeth. But for now, no cars, no cops, no issues. Cool.
So obviously what both of those do are exactly what the opening of any crime novel should do. You got to turn the page. You got to find out what's going to happen next. One thing I loved about yours is when we hear about a novel set in France, we know what we're going to get. We're going to get the left bank, we're going to get cafes, maybe fields of sunflowers, but not creepy old houses in places where no one's been for a while. So I'm just curious, what is it about the hinterlands anywhere that lends itself to crime fiction?
Well, undiscovered spaces are there's always secrets to be found, right? And in discovering secrets, either a personal secret or a secret's in a house, or that's really what crime fiction is all about. Like what is being held back that no one else knows. And so that's a lot easier to do, and away from prying eyes. So, actually, one of the joys of writing about France is that you get to go to France. And so
It would be irresponsible not to.
Yes, I always go. And so last year I went and I did rent a car for the first time. I think it was kind of a disaster. No one showed me how to use reverse, but anyway, and I got like sideways, and it was crazy. I had to flag down some poor man. But anyway, I did drive through these back roads and in France they get smaller and smaller and more oppressive, and the trees are blocking out the sun, and it is it's atmospheric too. It's that's and like I said, I do love old houses. In the first book in the series, she inherits a little cottage in a small town, like an old Bastide village with a walled town in the Dordogne, and so that's how the French part of it starts. But there's a lot of undiscovered places. It's I've written one book that's mostly set in Paris, but which is one before this called Blame It on Paris, and had to put Paris in the title because people know Paris, but it's still I still like the countryside. Maybe that's from living in Montana.
Yeah. So early days, a month or two ago, when we were talking about this panel with the book fair, I'm the one that suggested the title, "Crime in the Hinterlands," and a little bit to my surprise, they picked it up. And now I realized, oh shit, I don't actually know what I'm going to say about crime in the Hinterlands. I think for me. To speak to Lisa's point, a lot of it is the unanswered question and the potential of the countryside, and for me as well. I think it opens the door to some colorful characters. In my case, characters that you're very familiar with, so you can do a riff on the people that you know. It's easier. It's less work as a novelist. And I'm not sure it goes very far beyond that. I think the engine of the story is the unanswered question, and what keeps us involved in the novel, I think, are our investment in the characters. We need to believe in them, and we need to feel empathy for them, and we need to cheer them on, and we need to feel satisfaction when they meet their goals. For me, that's easier in the countryside, among people that I know and I personally have empathy with. Having said that, much of this novel, and it occurred to me recently that my other novels as well, a good portion of the conflict, the action is taking place in New York City. So I think by juxtaposing those two, going back and forth between New York and small town Montana, having the characters bounce between them, you get insight by the juxtaposition into the other area. So the characters coming from New York have a particular way of looking at Montana, and the Montana characters going to New York have a particular way of looking at New York. And so the idea is that maybe you get insight into those places that you otherwise wouldn't.
Yeah, so the fish out of water is always a good thing, even if you don't dump a body.
That was a great scene, though. The fish picking through his cage was kind of awesome. Yeah. Switching gears a little bit, before the panel started, we were talking, as writers tend to do, but also as people tend to ask us, about your writing routine. I'm curious how both of you managed to be so productive, obviously leading very busy lives.
Well, I wish I had some kind of a secret for that, but and I no longer have another job, so I have more time than you do. But I feel like the one thing that if you want to be a writer, you have to be self-motivated. You have to really want to write, because it can be a real grind, and it can be very hard. It's not digging ditches, but to get to the end of a novel and have everything kind of fit together and be satisfying, and somebody likes it. It's not, it's just, it's something you have to really want to do. So, pretty much just, and now I'm kind of just like on a schedule, I try to get a book out every year, and that's not, I know people that are a lot more prolific than me. So.
I admire and envy the writers who are able to juggle work and writing routine. Gwen is amazing. I can't imagine. We were just talking about before this panel started. Gwen gets up early morning and writes for a couple of hours, and then she goes off to her full-time newspaper job.
About 2 in the afternoon, I start sort of nodding off.
More coffee.
Yeah.
I think you fit it in as you have the opportunity. For me, I haven't had much opportunity. My work situation has changed in the last year or so. And I have found myself writing, maybe that's one of the reasons I write more poetry. I can fit in a little poem, I can steal half an hour from my day job and write a little poem. And then the next day I'll rewrite it, and so on. So, I'll end up writing maybe a decent poem a month at this point, which still feels like a lot. I look forward to the day when I can get back to writing fiction, though. It's when you are in that routine and then you step away from it, it feels like a huge part of your life is missing and going unexplored.
Yeah, when I'm not writing, I feel less grounded. Writing fiction, if you've done it for a long time, it's kind of like breathing, and you just have to get back to it.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. I'm not fun to be around if I go a few days without writing, and I've likened it to missing a limb or something. It just, everything's off kilter. So both of you run small presses. I'm really curious about that. Can you talk about why you started that? What's involved in it? It sounds like, again, just an amazing amount of work, and just what you get out of it.
Well, saying you run your own small press these days is like saying 10, 15 years ago that you were self-published, right? So it's the same thing. There are other aspects to it that are a lot easier now. There's all kinds of, like incredible software and, resources, groups of other writers and all that. So it's not, but when I first got started with a friend of mine, Katie Munger, who's a mystery writer from North Carolina, and she and I wanted to get our backlist into print. So we were both started publishing in the early 90s, and by like 2001 we were out of print. I mean that's just the way it works, and so we got our rights back, and we were getting our books back, and then around we started about 2007, and then like in 2007 and 8 is when the Kindle came out and everything just exploded. So it's really not that difficult anymore, people, put their books up, on all kinds of e-reader sites, and these books are all print on demand, and they look just as nice as any other trade paperback, I think. Of course, I could be biased.
So my wife and I were living in New York about 10 years ago, and one of my wife's good friends from high school was in town, and when we were visiting, we went out for drinks, and he was talking about his experience with he was a writer, talking about his experience with his publisher. He was writing in a genre that I hadn't heard of before, something called bizarro fiction, and it's a thing. I didn't know that. And his publisher, turns out, was a POD publisher in Portland called Eraserhead Press. And he was talking about POD, print on demand, and this publisher, and how well he was doing and how well the publisher was doing. And it struck me as a really interesting business model. So as a small press publisher, you don't have to invest with the print-on-demand revolution, which was safe to say the bloom has kind of gone off that rose a little bit, but at the time it was very exciting. You don't have to invest in huge amounts of money in big press runs, and depending on your business model, you can get by with smaller advances and then a profit share model, so everyone is equally invested in the project. And so my wife and I started talking, and I realized that maybe this is something we could do. So I went out and working on a shoestring. We didn't have any real money to put into it, but I worked as an editor, and I knew that side of the business. And working on a shoestring, I went out and taught myself some graphic design software, and invested in that. Bought a new laptop, and pretty soon we had Bangtail Press up and running, and I was able to publish some good friends of mine and writers I admired, and made some new friends down the way. At this point, we've published 18 or 20 different books, including most recently my own children's book, harkening back to the self-published thing. It's been a wonderful experience. I think in some ways some of the most interesting work being done in the landscape is coming from the small presses. At this point, Bangtail is again reflecting my own work situation. Is kind of chugging along in neutral a little bit, but we have another couple of projects on the horizon in the future. It's been a great experience. I'm not sure what else to say. I'm happy to talk further about it if anyone is interested in that discussion.
Well, and I think now when writers get together, they talk as much about the publishing world as we talk about writing anymore. Yep. It's changing so fast and in so many bewildering ways, and I wonder if we're sort of continuing on the same thing, but if you have any thoughts about where things are going, how it affects what you're doing, I would love to hear that.
Well, as a genre writer, and so mystery, romance, sci-fi, bizarro, I don't know, a few things like that are, the people consume them very rapidly, and so that's why they are very much the top of the electronic reader lists, but publishing has just, it's, like from one year to the next, it can change. And the good thing about, I don't sell very many print-on-demand paperbacks, but the ones I do, I don't have to deal with them at all. I don't have to ship them. I don't have to pay postage. It's very convenient that way. But it's not super lucrative, but it's and there's just a small market, like I said, for genre print books. But except for yours.
Oh, please.
And in my very first publisher was Walker, and they published hardcovers mainly for the library market. Just a real small, like $3,000 or $4,000 print, $3,000 or $4,000 print run. Just so you didn't make a lot of money on that either. So or the collectors, I guess, liked them, but it's not like you were getting it out there to the world. Whereas now, I have readers. I have people on my mailing list that live on every continent but Antarctica.
Go for Antarctica.
Yeah, I'm like, come on. But that's they write to me, and it's fabulous. So the way that the internet and the digital world has changed publishing is just it's kind of awesome.
I agree. Nothing to add.
No more? Okay.
Yeah.
One of the things people tend to ask you is when you become published is, oh, you must be making a lot of money. And I laugh and laugh.
Yeah.
I've always said I have found the one way to make even less money than as a journalist. It's kind of terrifying. Well, what are each of you working on now? What's next?
So I've been trying to do like one big novel a year, and then I try to do a little side project, like that's shorter and more doable. I have kind of like a novella or something like that. Like last year, I did this little book, this cookbook that's got French recipes in it. So this year, I'm doing a little kind of offshoot. The boyfriend of the main character in the books is a policeman in France, and he's a wine fraud detective. So there's a lot of wine stuff in the books. And so everyone seems to really like Pascal. So I decided to write a book about Pascal. So the next one, it's got more. It's going to be just a short, like probably. I think it's going to be a trilogy of kind of linked, like little cliffhanger trilogy, but short, 3 short things, and about wine fraud in France.
I've been making notes on a sequel to Sweeney. Not very far down that road, but eventually I would like to publish part 2. My original vision was to do a trilogy that would follow this guy through a larger story arc. I'm not sure if that'll happen, but I hope so. I would like to write another children's book. My last one was a history of Montana for early readers. I think the same thing about Yellowstone Park would probably go well. And my most interesting project, it occurred to me about a year ago that I don't have an especial fondness or with a few exceptions, all that much respect for writing how-to manuals. There's some really good ones out there, don't get me wrong, but for the most part, I haven't found them to be especially helpful to me. But in my journals and in my own notes, I have lots of advice about writing. And it's all advice to myself. Don't forget to make the character believable. That's remember to do that. And it occurred to me going through my old journals and notes that if you take some of these little tidbits and if you break the line early, it kind of makes some interesting found poetry. So I have like 150 pages of tiny little found poems about writing and writing advice, and
I like that.
I need to find out. If I do say so, whether you take the advice as valuable or not, it's a cool idea. And I really want to see that published somehow, and I'm not sure just how. But that's on the horizon too.
Actually, I'd like to hear from you a couple of snippets and also some writing advice from you.
Oh, go ahead.
You can remember the
If I can remember.
yeah.
So two poems. When I was initially doing the reading tour for Sweeney, that was how I ended it, was reading some of these poems. One of them is tongue in cheek, if I can remember it. It was the title is a haiku that spilled over, and you have to remember that I'm an editor. I've made most of my living through my career editing other people's writing. So this haiku. The haiku that spilled over is writers who, and I may get the syllables wrong, but writers who try to give other advice to other writers about writing are assholes.
So I just asked you guys to make that. Sorry about that.
It's easy.
And then the companion to that, the next page, this is called This Is How You Write. And it's, you sit down every morning and try to punch out your own bloody teeth, but joyfully.
Oh, that's not a hard act to follow.
Well, I always wanted to write a writing, advice book, but mine was called, Everything I Know About Writing from Being a Domestic Diva, like, clean your house and, get rid of all the clutter, all the things that you heard about. But I'm really not a domestic diva, and so I didn't really get very far with that and, metaphor. But that's, there are, when you think about it, that it is sort of like life, you get rid of all the boring things. I took a picture once, like you restructure your novel and then note to yourself, like, get rid of all the boring bits, it's just common sense stuff. But, when you're really close to work, you can't see that. And so sometimes you have to, knock yourself on the head.
I actually have had parts in novels where I'm writing along and I don't know what happens next, and I'll go, something interesting happens now. I'll figure that out later. I think if I did a book, it would be, don't do what Gwen does. Questions from the audience? I think we have a wealth of knowledge here that we should take advantage of while they're here with us.
Oh, this is so nice.
Yeah.
So if you don't make any money writing, why are we in the business?
I'm throwing that to you guys. So many people have asked me that, yeah.
Well, I do make money. I mean, I'm not like in the red. So, especially
Poverty.
especially, well, I don't support myself on my writing, but I do make money. And it's like we were just talking about, like if writing is really your thing, you just you do it. You do it whether you make money at it or not. You do it whether anybody else likes it or not. You do it so that you can breathe, so that you can, get whatever that was out of your system and go on to something that's a little bit nicer. Whatever it takes, you just do it.
I've worked in addition to my editorial work for established publishers, I've worked as a freelance editor, which means that people come to me with their books and ask me to shape them and help them publish them, eventually either self-published or submit them to a publisher. And consistently there's, in my mind, unlike the expectations are out of line with what will actually happen. People think they're going to write a book and then everyone will flock to buy it and they'll make a ton of money, and then you're on the Today Show being interviewed. And the fact is that just doesn't happen. And so my standard line to folks is that there are a number of reasons to publish a book, and that making money off of it is well down on the list, to my mind. So you can publish it for posterity, for your friends and family. You can publish it so your grandkids have something to read. You can publish it so that you do receive a little bit of local notoriety. You get a picture in the paper. That's very satisfying. You find your satisfactions where you can, and in addition, you get the satisfaction of having created something that did not exist prior to your work. And if I had to parse it out and figure out why I'm still doing it, I think that would be top of the list. So here is a novel. Here is a set of believable characters. Here is some interesting turns of phrase. And these people and this world did not exist prior to my sitting down at the typewriter and wrenching it into being. And for me, that is very, very satisfying. And I got paid a little bit of money, not enough to buy a good used car. The money was icing on the cake. The real satisfaction is that something exists that didn't prior to that. And the people whose opinions I care about, friends and family, those people are reading it and saying nice things and telling me that I spent my time in a worthwhile fashion. And for me, that's good enough.
When my first novel was published, my first thought, which is kind of silly now, but was immortality. I mean, like, once you write a book, there's little chance that it will never, you know, that it'll go it'll disappear forever, right? Once it's in print, you know, it'll at least be at the Library of Congress, right? Or somewhere. And your great grandchildren can read it and say, hey, look what happened, you know? This was written by someone related to me. So, a minor thing, maybe, but, you know, it's kind of important.
I think it's interesting we're having this discussion in an art gallery surrounded by these really beautiful works, and we know that these people did not start off drawing and painting at this level. I think one of the frustrating things for a lot of writers is because everybody writes, right? And so people tend to think, oh, you just write a book. And I don't think until you try to do it, you realize how freaking hard it is. And it's just annoying as hell to try and make it all come together. And when you end up with products like this, where you do have characters that people want to follow and that they identify with and that they're rooting for, and the writing is wonderful, it is just a great thing. And I think taking your satisfaction in that is really important.
Yeah, hearing back from readers is amazing.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
Other questions? Yes.
Is there any typical thing you see when you're writing Hinterlands type of mystery versus a big city? What's your key difference when you're talking about crime in the Hinterlands versus crime in a city? Is there a key difference, or are there a lot? Maybe that's.
Thanks for getting us back on topic.
Yes. Well, I think the big city mysteries are often more gritty, more noir-ish. You know, we were talking about, like, if your book is set in New York or Los Angeles or some other big city that lots of people either live in or have been to, then you don't really need to do a lot of scene setting either. You know, you don't need to tell them where all the skyscrapers are, or, you know, it doesn't really matter, right? So, but if you're taking people in a book to a place that either they haven't been or they never will see, and you're able to describe it for them, you know, in a way that makes it seem real to them, then that's the main difference, I think, in a novel set in a out-of-the-way place.
I think in comparison to LA fiction, LA crime, or New York crime, you were also, if you decide to set your novel in LA, if you decide to set your novel exclusively in New York, you are working within a tradition of New York crime fiction or LA crime fiction. But I think those two cities in particular, Chicago, it's hard to write an LA crime novel without realizing that Michael Connelly exists, you know, so you would have to play off him one way or the other. You'd have to either pay tribute or you'd have to visibly reject him. So I'm not sure if this is true or not, but it feels like writing in the Hinterlands should be freeing in some way. You are writing outside tradition, you are creating your own tradition. Not sure if that's true, but it's an interesting idea.
Well, and I was going to ask, is there a Western crime tradition, or is there becoming one?
Are you
Both of you?
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't really think there is. Alan and I were talking about this, you know, like when my first books came out, it was like, well, this is a regional book. This is just for regional people that are just interested in regional fiction, you know. But then, you know, like Tony Hillerman kind of broke that mold for all of us by writing books that, you know, everybody enjoyed, you know, no matter where they lived. And but it's taken a while. You know, I would say if there's a Western crime tradition, it's from Tony.
I I would agree. I would add Jim Crumley to that as well. I think Jim was one of the early pioneers in that regard. I wrote about, as part of the publicity for Sweeney, I wrote a short essay online about Crumley and the influence that he had on me personally. So I see Crumley as an early part of that vanguard as well.
Right. Absolutely.
Other questions?
Well, I just add that over the last 10 years, I've seen a flourishing of what I call kind of hillbilly crime. It's stuff placed in Ohio and the Appalachians, and they're meth dealers and moonshine.
Well, Daniel Woodrell.
Oh, man.
Yeah.
That's become popular. I remember I was working in the emergency room at the time, and I was put off by this because I think, I know these assholes. They handcuffs on, and they've just had a fight with the police, but that's been a flourishing thing. I think Breaking Bad came out of that literature movement, so I think it's real. I don't know what to call it.
Yeah.
It's interesting, when Breaking Bad was on, and just starting, I think every writing conference I mentioned Breaking Bad as an example of really propulsive writing.
Yeah.
Like they would say, just, people would watch it and write down each scene, trying to figure out how that show was put together and how to apply it to novels. It's pretty awesome. Other questions? Yeah?
When you, I find that when I'm writing fiction, that when I'm really into it, the characters are just living in my head constantly, and I almost can't get away from them. I don't know if you experience it or not.
Well, that's usually a good thing. That means that you're really embodied your character with your character, and it's usually when I dream about my characters, I'm like, okay, I'm really there. So that's a good thing. I wouldn't fight it.
Yeah. So between my first and second novels, I wrote a very, very bad novel that will forever go unpublished. And it's very hard to have any sense of objectivity on your own work. You have to step away. A few years later, you can look back and say, yeah, that's pretty good. So at the time, I thought it was brilliant. Of course, it sucked. But it took me a while. But then I realized eventually that the thing that really made the novel not work was I did not believe in the characters. And I had almost no sympathy for the characters. I was, they were marionette dolls, and I was making them dance to a certain jig. I had the outline, and by God, I was going to force these characters to do what I wanted them to do. And the end result was, just awful. I mean, to put it bluntly. So my tiny little epiphany was that if I didn't believe in the characters, the reader wasn't going to believe in them either. So part of my process is, and this is probably a little schizophrenic, but it's to sit down and convince myself that these people are actually real. So believing in the characters to the point where they can haunt you, I think, is a good thing.
Yeah. That just makes you finish the story, so they'll get out of your head.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Kill them off.
Which is tempting sometimes. Well, Jim Burke said the other day that one of the first questions a psychiatrist will ask you is, do you hear voices? And if you're a writer, it's like, well, duh.
Yeah.
They're yelling at me all the time. But you're not supposed to say that. I think we've got time for one more question, if anyone else has anything. Is there anything you all would like to say? Just wrapping up.
This is a fun discussion. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, I really appreciate you guys, and I appreciate you all letting me, as I said, just pick their brains about a whole variety of topics, because they're great to talk with. Thank you.
Thank you guys for coming.